Welcome everyone to the IMF's conference on climate-related natural disasters. The COVID-19 pandemic still weighs upon us, but we cannot forget that climate change is affecting our present and it will continue to affect our futures as it makes extreme weather events like floods and droughts and wildfires more frequent and devastating. Regrettably, developing countries are facing the brunt of climate change, even though many of them do not materially contribute to the climate crisis. And the pandemic has raised the hurdle by subsuming their already limited resources. Today, we will discuss the effects of natural disasters on these communities and economies and how policies should be designed to allow countries to adapt to this new reality. We start off with a superb policy panel where our managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, who has long been a champion of disaster risk reduction, will discuss climate adaptation with two policymakers who witness the climate calamity every day. Prime Minister Mottley of Barbados and the Minister of Economy and Finance, Randriamandrato of Madagascar. Now, after the panel, we have two excellent sessions with a fantastic lineup of speakers who will discuss their research findings on the risks, the various forms of adaptation, and how monetary and fiscal policies can help. As you can see, we have quite a lot going on and a lot of excellent material to cover. So let's just get started. I will hand it over to Haslinda Amin of Bloomberg, who will moderate the policy panel. Haslinda, over to you.
Geeta, thank you so much for that. Now, as Geeta said, the climate crisis looms over the world, but the negative impact is disproportionately burdening smaller emerging nations. They're at risk of catastrophic consequences with rising sea levels, droughts, heat wave, wildfires, and their ability to protect themselves and adapt is made even more challenging with limited resources amid the pandemic. So how can small and developing economies adapt? What should their priorities be, and what can the international community really do? I'm privileged to introduce our distinguished speakers today. Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the IMF, Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados, and of course, Economy and Finance Minister of Madagascar, Randriamandrato. Thank you so much for your time today. Prime Minister Mottley, let's start with you. For small states like Barbados, it is 1.5 to stay alive. Global warming needs to be contained to 1.5 degrees Celsius, or it could be catastrophic. Give us a sense of the magnitude of climate change that you're having to deal with.
First of all, let me thank you, Madam Moderator, for having me here, and let me say welcome, or hello, rather, to Managing Director, who has proven herself to be a global champion at this stage, and of course to my colleague from Madagascar, let me say good morning. The reality is that the effort to reach 1.5 is not a noble goal, but it's our reality in terms of what we need to be able to succeed. And we have, over the course of the last, I would say, 2 decades, seen increasing incursions in our way of life as a result of climate. We have had, for example, the presence of sargassum weed in the region, going right up to the Gulf of Mexico. That was not with us 15 years ago. We've had increasing droughts, in our case in Barbados, and I call the droughts and the water shortages the chronic NCDs of the climate crisis, and the hurricanes are the heart attacks. And of course, we are in the heart attack season, but what makes it worse is that we learned as kids to be on standby from June to end of October, and we now have 2 extra months every year, so that for most of our small island developing states, we're facing the spectacle of floods or hurricanes or high winds for more than half the year. Now, that doesn't allow us to plan easily, and as a result, there's always a contingency that's required. In addition, this year, we were further affected by the volcanic eruption in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which, while 90 miles away, has literally played havoc with us in Barbados with respect to blanketing the entire country in ash for weeks. Effectively, it took us to clean up. So these things are real, and if we have to spend money there in order to deal with these things, it means we're not spending money on the SDGs and the other development goals. So I'll stop at this stage. Thank you.
Prime Minister, the clock is ticking, though, right? Because a UN report suggests that within less than a decade, we'll find it impossible to contain temperature rises to 1.5 degrees.
I watch that dashboard on Sky all the time that says that within 12 years we'll be at 1.5. And I ask myself, who else in the world is watching it? Or is it just simply that the world has come to the conclusion that small island developing states are dispensable? And therefore we've started to change the tone and the space of our argument, because we say, okay, if you're not listening to SIDS, since 1994, we've been talking about the extreme vulnerability of small island developing states. But clearly you're not listening to us. So what's the next thing to do? Let us broaden the argument to who next is affected. And that is all of those countries between the tropics of Cancer and the tropics of Capricorn. So that, believe you me, this is something that is not going to stop at us. We are simply the first ones. And as was so eloquently stated earlier, we're not on the front line. So we are on the front line, but we're not on the ones who are causing the problem in the first place. So these are some of the things that are truly disturbing us at a moral level. But beyond morality, we have to live. And what then happens, those countries that are not yet affected are going to have to ask themselves, what are the consequences of small island states not being able to sustain themselves or their people? Is it going to be an issue of climate refugees? Is it going to be an issue of global insecurity or hemispheric or regional insecurity? There are a whole host of things that fall from this that I'm not sure that we are sufficiently thinking and planning for.
Right. Minister Randriamandrato, I want to bring you in. How might this all play out in Madagascar? You have flooding, on the other hand, prolonged droughts leading to famine, food insecurity, and it's going to get worse.
Correct. As you know, Madagascar is not a small island. It's the biggest island in the world, with a lot of challenges as regard to disaster risk. And as His Honorable Excellence, the Prime Minister from Barbados said, we are also facing, unfortunately, the same challenges as small islands, cyclones, drought, floods, and also invasion of locusts every year. And this, of course, cost a lot of damages for our island, region by region. The cost of these damages, cyclone, drought, and locust invasion, for example, during the last 10 years, is about $2.5 billion. That is a lot of money. Cost of drought and cyclone alone per episode cost about $40 to $50 million per year. And therefore, we have to take into account the necessity to take, consideration of public policies in our, for example, in the finance and the state budget every year. Fortunately, we have the support of the IMF. I thank the managing director of the IMF for her precious support. We have benefited from, the extended credit facility, and the World Bank, as well as other donors, continue to also help us, facing these challenges. I think we need to remain vigilant, and the most important is to make sure that public policies, as regard to this disaster, the disaster management in general, must take into account the vulnerability of, the populations region by regions, because again, Madagascar is a big island. It's the biggest. It's about 590,000 square kilometers with many microclimate situation, and therefore, the population in this region suffer a lot from this, natural disaster and the climate change in general. So there is an international and a world responsibility, but also, the Madagascar government also has its own, duties as far as facing these disasters is concerned vis-à-vis public policy.
We'll pick up on the point slightly later. I want to bring in Kristalina. You've talked about giving the most vulnerable a fair shot at a better future. That's getting even harder because the climate crisis has been compounded by the pandemic. What are your biggest concerns for small and low-income countries, and how much worse has that become over the last 15, 18 months?
I am very humbled to be on the same panel with those who are virtually on the front line of dealing with the consequences of natural disasters compounded now by COVID-19. For tourism-dependent economies, COVID has been devastating. And for us at the IMF, that recognition that we are all vulnerable, but the level of vulnerability in some countries, because of size and because of location, is much higher. And therefore, our attention ought to be concentrated on where the needs are most severe. Let me make 3 points at the start of our very important discussion. One, we are living in a more shock-prone world, and climate change is aggravating the frequency and intensity of disasters. It is not linear. In other words, we have to be prepared that these shocks can become truly dramatic unless we act. And that action, of course, is first grounded in mitigation, trying to arrest the danger that climate change presents on us by reducing the speed of temperature increases globally. Let us remember, we say 1.5 is the max we can tolerate. We are now at 1.2. My second, but of course we need to combine mitigation with adaptation. My second point is the economic rationale for investing in adaptation. The evidence is clear. $1 invested in disaster resilience, in adapting to this changing climate, brings $4 to $7 in damage prevented. In other words, it is a worthy investment to save lives, to protect livelihoods, but also to reduce the cost that comes from disasters. My third point is that policies matter, and we at the IMF have our work cut out for us in terms of integrating adaptation holistically in policy recommendations, in policies that we help countries shape for their future. And I'm sure we will talk a lot about it, but let me just stress that that requires attention on the whole line of policies that countries ought to embrace, starting from investing in prevention, physical investment, also building financial resilience. In other words, having the built-up buffers, building up insurance as a way to handle shocks when they come, spending policies, how we integrate the need to adapt in public spending, the disclosure requirements, so private sector can also understand risks and participate in mitigating these risks. And last but not least, how we generate support internationally for those who have done very little to cause the problem, but are faced most dramatically with its consequences. And we at the IMF are doing our part in working on that part of the solution as well.
More needs to be done. Kristalina, you talk about policy mattering. Professor Mottley, I want to bring you this. I want to bring you in. You kept pushing and have now succeeded in including natural disaster clauses in debt instruments, building what was started by your neighbor, Grenada. How did you convince creditors to accept the clauses?
It was difficult, but we recognize that what most people need in life is certainty. And by having the natural disaster clauses, we bring certainty to those who are lending and certainty to those who are borrowing. And regrettably, I wish we would have had it for the pandemic, quite frankly, because the absence of those clauses has meant that many countries literally have put at risk their capacity to have an environment of certainty as to how they go forward, largely because the increased debt that has come during the process of the pandemic has come on top of what existed before. And that is why I believe that there was an attempt to help with the debt service suspension initiative. But for many middle-income countries who are small island developing states or who are not capable of relying on international capital markets, this became an issue for us. So I'm very happy that we had these clauses. I wish, however, that they were there for the pandemic as well. And I wish also that the international financial institutions would take it up, and we've been campaigning for that, largely because, and I'm talking specifically more about the regional development banks and the multilateral development banks, because quite frankly, it will give us that fiscal space for 2 years should an event occur. And if we had had it with the pandemic, we would have been able to remove on average 7 to 8% of our own GDP in terms of fiscal space to meet the concerns. Our debt has gone from 177% to 118%, and it has gone back up now to 152%, largely as a result of the pandemic. And the majority of that, 30 percentage points of that, is not because of increased borrowing, but because of contraction of our economy. Kristalina said just now that the tourism-dependent countries have been among the hardest hit. Let me put it even in further context. The only countries that have been worse hit than us last year are war-torn countries. Our declines have been double-digit in most instances in the Eastern Caribbean. They hover around 18, 19%. In Aruba, 25%. In Maldives, 33%. So that this thing has reversed us at least by a decade in terms of nominal terms, but more like 2 decades in terms of real losses.
You talked about higher debt, Prime Minister. Would that make it even more difficult going forward to include natural disaster clauses in debt instruments? And your fiscal space helped you.
I don't know that it should make it more difficult for us to include the clauses. I think that the clauses should be a standard because, as I said, it brings certainty to the lender and the borrower, because everybody knows that if a certain trigger takes place, we're then in a position to say, look, we are going to have a moratorium on principal for the next 2 years on the debt, and we're going to capitalize the interest at the back end. So at the end of the day, the lender doesn't really lose, but what it does is to create that fiscal space for the borrower such that we can move forward with certainty. You keep using the example of Britain, and it's slightly different, but if Britain had to pay for its war debt immediately as the war was finished, it would not have been able to rebuild Britain. And what is needed now is a bespoke set of arrangements, in my view, that allow us to be able to refinance the COVID debt into long-term instruments. But it's not only that, if we don't have the fiscal space to spend the money that we can get at concessional terms, we still are nowhere better in terms of being able to meet the needs of our country as policymakers. So it's both access to concessional resources and access to fiscal space. The fiscal space is assisted by the natural disaster clauses initially, but there is still then the fiscal space that is determined by the fiscal anchor. And if the fiscal anchor is not moved sufficiently, then we're still going to have a program of austerity. And may I say, you can always bring back down debt as we've shown. But what we can't do is reverse the social implosion, which invariably takes a generation to reverse. So these are the real issues that are fighting us, and this is where we feel that if we can have certainty on natural disaster and pandemic clauses, then it allows us to be able to deal with the other things that are more complex and may well take a generation to deal with, like climate, like social implosion.
Mm-hmm.
Minister Randriamandrato, cyclones, floods, droughts, devastating consequences. They put tremendous pressure on Madagascar's finances, on real GDP growth. How has your government responded?
Well, first of all, we consider the fact that climate change is a reality, today's reality, and it will take time to reverse the devastating effect of the climate change. This is a global issue, and therefore we took into consideration the long-term, perspective versus short-term policies. Definitely, we had to define a new, public policies in various, sectors: environment, fiscal policies, population adaptation and resilience, and even, the capacity of small communities to adapt themselves to this, long-term, social effect of global climate change. So we put in place a structure capable of, better manage financial aid from donors, international community, as well as local financing. A second effort that we have done is that we improved the way we work with international donors, the World Bank, the IMF, as I mentioned previously, as well as bilateral donors, because we continue to request these assistance and technical assistance as well as financial assistance, because as you rightly mentioned, dear Kristalina, this is a global issue. This is a global responsibility. As islands, small islands or big island like Madagascar, we have nothing to do. To be honest, we have nothing to do with global emission of carbon, for example. So yes, we take our part of responsibility, but this must be done in accordance to international arrangements and so on. Voila.
Kristalina, the IMF has committed to helping to build buffers to shocks for countries. What is the IMF doing about channeling special drawing rights to small island states to middle-income countries?
Well, thank you for asking this question. We stepped up in this COVID crisis like never before in our history. We have provided financial lifelines to 86 countries in a record short period of time. And most importantly, we were a voice for reason on how countries with high debt levels should manage that crisis. Mia mentioned the debt service suspension initiative. It was just a simple economic logic. If the economy is brought to a standstill, how could the poor country services its debt? And she's right to say that where we felt short as international community is to integrate small, highly vulnerable economies into that debt service suspension initiative. I do welcome very much her call to systematically integrate a state contingent approach to how debt should be structured and what clauses there would be. We, of course, welcome what has been done in integrating a common sense clause in the lending instruments of countries that are frequently hit by disasters. You asked about the SDRs. One of the big things we have done early in this crisis is to recognize that reserve requirements in the world have gone up, and that the COVID crisis has pushed countries to exhaust very often very limited reserves they count on. When your economy shrinks by 10%, at the same time you have to increase spending because of the pandemic, that of course makes you deep into your reserves to a dangerous level. So we have the agreement to have $650 billion new SDR allocation. It is going to be in place by mid-August. It would help all countries, but of course it is most valuable for countries with limited reserves and in vulnerable positions. This being said, we also recognize that because of our structure, the advanced economies are getting a higher share, relatively speaking, of these reserves. The emerging markets, developing economies are getting a smaller share, about 40% of this new allocation. And a very obvious question is, can we do something to redirect SDRs from countries that are getting it but don't need it to countries that desperately need more help? And I'm so very pleased that now we have the G7 coming up with support for about $100 billion redirected from countries with strong reserve positions to countries that need help. And moreover, that there is now openness in our membership that we would expand the beneficiaries of this on-lending highly concessional terms from low-income countries to a broader group of low, middle-income countries, and very important for the two members of the panel, to countries that are more vulnerable to climate shocks. I expect that in the next months we would be working relentlessly on creating what we notionally call Resilience and Sustainability Trust. Well, the exact name to be defined, of course, with our membership, but we are conveying what is the idea here, to have funding that goes to build resilience at a time when, as I said in the beginning, shocks are coming more frequently and they are more severe. I count very much on Mia. She has a strong voice on this topic to help us come up with the right design and do it fast.
Do it fast. How quickly would that be for this resilience and sustainability trust, Kristalina?
Well, of course, I can tell you immediately that the very first delivery of this on-lending will be through the existing poverty reduction and growth trust that we have at the IMF, and many vulnerable to climate shock countries are benefiting from it already. So when we build the second notionally called Resilience and Sustainability Trust, it would take us a little bit of time because it is new. It is not like expanding the operation of an existing entity. My aspiration, of course, it depends on the membership. My aspiration is to have it by the end of the year. As you know, this year we'll have a flagship event, COP26. It is so important that we use COP26 to mobilize the world for action. And I would do, my colleagues, myself, we would do our best to mobilize the membership towards an agreement so we can go to COP26 and say, here is an additional contribution to building a more resilient world on the foundation of multilateral cooperation, on the foundation of solidarity.
Prime Minister Mottley, Kristalina has conveyed that she would like input on this resilience and sustainability trust. I mean, what are some of the considerations you'd like to bring forward?
I think that the direction that Kristalina has been fighting for is one that we have supported from day one. And the reality is we do know that there's some advanced economies that simply don't need their support. But there are small states like ours and large islands like my friend from Madagascar and middle-income countries that are not capable of drawing money from the international capital markets. All of us who are vulnerable are finding it difficult. And to the extent that we can get some increased space to help us meet the demands, that is going to be huge. We also have and hope that the funding which has been being worked on with respect to raising funds for adaptation, that if that can be added for project-based funding as opposed to the kind of general support that we would expect from the increased SDRs reallocation in terms of budget support. The project funding, however, is separate. And we have, for example, said, look, rather than having multiple small projects, we feel that we need to do projects that are transformational. And we've come up with a notion of something called roofs to reefs, because what is it that's really at stake in a climate crisis? It's the roofs over people's heads, and it goes right down to what literally happens in the coastal areas where the reefs are dying at an alarmingly rapid rate, and where the absence of those reefs then put coastal installations at further risk. So we feel that if we can mobilize the funds to be able to build the defenses that will protect us from the immediate consequences of the climate crisis there, that's critical. Secondly, we're finding that we have to spend a huge amount of money. This year alone, because of the combination of climate and ashfall, we are now having to revise and for the first time spend about just over 1% of GDP on water augmentation and distribution. And this has never happened to us before. So we are facing additional expenditures at the very time that the pandemic has removed from us just about a third of our revenues. So I don't even need to explain further to you what that has meant. And let me just say before this finishes, because I really want to thank IMF, Kristalina, Alejandro, who has now left, Bert, who has been with us. Without the IMF working with us and without the restructuring we did before the pandemic, God knows where we would be today. And I therefore thank everyone for walking step in step with us. We're not where we need to be yet, but at least we're going in the right direction. And I hope that the conversations on the reallocated SDRs, as well as the very practical reality of why we need to expand the fiscal anchor in order to create the fiscal space, because no amount of money is worthwhile to me if I can't spend it. And right now, that is a major problem that we have, that we can't spend what we need to spend in order to avert the worst, which according to the international community could be as close as 12 years.
Kristalina, we talk about that reallocated SDRs. What if countries spend it and in the end is unable to repay it?
Let me start by stressing that the most immediate relief that comes from the SDR allocation is this boost of reserves that countries will receive. And it is at no cost to anyone in the membership. This is deploying the strength of the collective to create this reserve asset called special drawing rights. When we discuss on lending through the IMF some of the SDRs that countries in strong reserve positions could afford to redirect, we need to remember that as we do so, we have to protect the reserve asset nature of these special drawing rights. So it is not trivial how we would go about creating this on-lending capacity. But we have done it through the PRGT. Over the last year, we have increased concessional finance by $24 billion. Two-thirds of it came from on-lending existing SDRs. So we know that it is possible, we know how to do it. When we do it on a scale much larger than what we have done before, and we protect the reserve asset nature of SDRs, there would be questions about credit risk, how it is being handled, about providing significant concessionality, how we do it, that we are still to answer. But the simple concept is this. We are to take SDRs on voluntary basis in our hands and then redirect it, on-lend it at highly concessional terms. In other words, longer maturities, very low interest rates. Let's remember the SDR interest rate is 0.05, in other words, 5 bips. Do what many countries have been urging us to contribute to, which is build a bridge between low interest rates in advanced economies and the developing world, where, as you know, interest rates are not, by far not 5 basic points. So that is where we are headed. We are very much calling on the membership to lean forward. We are in a very difficult place as a world. We are faced with dangerously diverging recoveries. Advanced economies on the backs of fiscal space and vaccination are growing this year much faster than emerging markets, developing countries with limited fiscal space and slow vaccinations. So we have an incredibly important job to do this year, next year, to bring this divergence back to a place when the whole world is growing. And if I may, if we succeed, the benefit, the economic benefit is huge. We would get $9 trillion more in output between now and 2025 if we overcome this dangerous divergence. SDRs part of the solution, and believe you me, I so much take it to heart to make them work to the fullest for the membership.
I love the enthusiasm, Kristalina. Minister Randriamandrato, I want to bring you in. Speaking of policies that matter, Madagascar is the first country in Africa that's taken up the ARC tropical cyclone insurance coverage. Talk to us about how significant this is in your risk management policy.
It is most significant for Madagascar because its approach is also as revolutionary as what managing director from the IMF just shared about this resilience trust, which is let me just say this: we are very much encouraged by this. Let's put it this way: it's a revolutionary vision as regard to how the IMF will contribute to, improve global financing for low-income countries. I think we shall continue to find new ways of facing long-term, effect of climate change. So yes, this insurance is new. in the same time, we have adopted a new insurance law, which allows small communities, small enterprises, to have a mechanism to offer product and services, insurance services. So we liberalized the insurance sector. So hopefully we will be able to be more autonomous vis-a-vis, donor assistance. Let me just add my voice to the Prime Minister of Barbados, who mentioned the need also to continue making effort as regards to having fiscal policies. We do not face climate change the same way, depending on the size of countries. Madagascar, for example, should have more capacities to face climate changes because it's a large island and we have, a geographic capacity to produce more rice, for example. And that what the government of Madagascar is doing right now. We are promoting, investment in rice production for the next coming years. We intend to expand rice field of up to 100,000 hectares. And we are also promoting deforestation. We are protecting reserves, natural reserves. And on top of that, of course, we have to help local communities through insurance like what you mentioned, so that they can adapt to these new realities. So yes, we continue to innovate, we continue to educate, we continue, of course, to convince international community also to support us moving forward in that direction.
Kristalina, we've often talked about tapping the private sector. How do you think we can galvanize private finance at scale?
What we recognize is that without private sector participation, there is no way to achieve the goals of mitigation, adaptation, transition to the new climate economy. And for this reason, we look at the key aspects of private sector participation in our own policy engagements, in our annual country policy assessments, in our financial sector assessments. And so the way we approach it is in 4 blocks, in four columns. One, make sure that we work with countries to create broadly good conditions for domestic and foreign investments. In other words, transparency, no red tape, because if we don't have conditions for private investment, all other things equal, there won't be anything going for sustainability either. So that is the first very important step. Secondly, we are concentrating on financial sector, because if the financial sector embraces sustainability, then what they lend for is going to be much more aligned with this concept of resilience. And in that regard, we are working with others, especially with the Network for Greening the Financial System, on creating robust and credible standards for disclosure and moving towards mandatory disclosure of climate-related financial stability risks. This is hugely important. Today, there are about 200 different frameworks on reporting. And almost half of the financial industry captains are saying, data is not reliable. We're not sure whether we can trust it. And that holds us back. So we have to narrow down these frameworks to very few, and then ensure the quality of data, the quality of reporting, and then make this reporting mandatory. This whole embracement of ESG only matters if we can trust what the reporting tells us, and it really shifts gear towards green investments, towards sustainable investments. Reinsurance. I cannot tell you how much I admire the determination of the insurance industry to be a partner in reshaping where money goes. Obviously, they have a big stake. If we don't get on top of these risks, many would become they would go bust, and many businesses and households cannot reach out for insurance. So getting the insurance piece in place is hugely important. Last but not least, public-private partnerships and the role development banks can play to reduce risk of entry, so we can see many more public-private projects on a large scale that play a transformative role. For us at the IMF, our role is to support through the work we do on data, on disclosure, and on supporting countries in good PPP policies, so we can see the private investment jumping up to where they have to be, in the order of trillions, to get the massive transformation we have to undertake done.
Prime Minister Mottley, in your capacity as Development Committee Chair, what are your expectations from that seat?
We're really trying to be able to get the world to listen and to take action. As I said, the issue of vulnerability remains an issue that has been talked about for 30 years, but it is real for us, because when that storm happens, there's vulnerability becoming real. And when you have a country like Dominica that loses 226% in one event overnight, then you begin to understand what we're talking about. Equally, there are those who continue to be hammered, and each time it becomes more difficult for them to recover. So in the Development Committee, we're trying to make the point that, look, it's okay to say that the middle-income countries have graduated in some instances, but what we're ignoring is that 70% of the poor people in this world live in middle-income countries. So when you only use low-income countries and you only use per capita income, excluding the very people that you really were established to help. Secondly, we're also recognizing that, as I said earlier, that it's not sufficient to have access to concessional finance if you don't have the fiscal space. Thirdly, we recognize that inclusive development is as important as not only green development, and that's why this year the theme is on green, resilient, and inclusive development. And if you really look at what's happening in the world, much of the social insecurity, and worse still with the pandemic, is driven by a lack of equity in populations, among populations, and that equity is literally causing serious social issues and crime to increase. And I fear, as we are seeing with migration, whether it is from Central America into the US or whether it is from North Africa and other areas into Europe, we're seeing the consequences of ill-informed development choices, not just as people would want us to believe within countries, but in an inhospitable global environment, to recognizing that the things that mattered when these institutions were formed 75, 76 years ago have changed. And many of the countries who are suffering were not there at the time of the formation of the UN or the IFIs. And to that extent, as Kristalina is trying to do, how can you create new instruments that are more appropriate to our condition rather than relying on an architecture that was established before we were here? Now, if the Development Committee doesn't go forward on these issues, then I fear that the gap globally is going to become worse and worse, and the global community is going to be a difficult place within which to function. The last point that I'd like to make is, of course, that Warsaw Mechanism on Loss and Damage seems to have fallen into the recesses of people's memory. And I refer to that because fundamentally, to ask countries to have to carry the cost of borrowing for something that they did not start, for something that they did not do. And in circumstances where, because of that cost of borrowing and that fiscal space that is eaten up, that it means that we can't get on to basic issues of education and housing and healthcare and those other things that are critical to the SDGs, critical to good governance, critical to being able to create a better quality of life. All of those things are being taken up because we have been diverted and having to face the reality of the climate crisis by the actions and greed of others elsewhere in this world. If we were looking at this within the context of our own countries, we would view this as a tortious act of liability. Damages would have to be paid to the people who were affected. And I believe that there is something morally reprehensible about a global community that does not recognize that it needs to provide not loans, but grants for those who are literally having to take up precious space and precious debt and put it in areas that are not of our own making.
We talk about how the richer countries need to do more. I'm wondering what your views are of the G7 meeting that just concluded. Rich nations, but some say, Greenpeace included, saying that the G7 have failed to set us up for a successful COP26. Your take on that?
I think that they're not listening sufficiently. I think that they're telling us what they want to say, and I appreciate that they are in the vicinity, in the neighborhood. But being in the neighborhood does not allow them to come to our particular issues and our particular homes to understand what are the real issues, whether it is on vaccines or whether it is on climate. The notion that you're going to give 1 billion vaccines by the end of next year does not help countries who are tourism and travel dependent and who have to open back their economies because they face either economic implosion if they keep the borders closed, or they face literally the virus run rampant and causing too many people to die in our shores. And when we hear these big ticket items at the helicopter level, when you drill down and ask, well, what does that really mean for these countries? You begin to understand that it doesn't move the needle very much. And that's why I believe that the Resilience and Sustainability Trust that Kristalina is trying to do is the closest thing that comes to where we need it to be. But I do believe that it has to be anchored by what goes on at COP26 in terms of the G7 and G20 countries realizing that the Warsaw Mechanism on Loss and Damage in Paris was put there for a reason, because these countries simply cannot afford to borrow while at the same time having to borrow for normal development needs. And I'm not sure why the world, why the UN, why the institutions are not allowing us to have that sensible conversation, but rather having small groups speak, and the small groups speak in a way that may assuage their conscience, but does not move the needle for our people very far.
Personally, IMF has called for a $50 billion COVID-19 spending. How much of that did the G7 commit to over the weekend?
So let me stress that the $50 billion plan we put forward is to bring the pandemic to a durable end by mid next year, on the backs of vaccinating by then 60% of the world in all countries. And that the price tag for it is actually, in relative terms, modest. 50 billion would generate in advanced economies over 5-year period $1 trillion of additional tax revenues, because we have brought the pandemic faster to an end, accelerated growth, and protected the world more against dangerous mutations. Now, that is the economic logic, and this is why I'm out there saying vaccine policy is economic policy. Please go do it. Where the G7 did make progress is on the most urgent of the steps we recommend to be taken, and it is to reallocate vaccines from surplus to deficit countries. They did come up with a number that is respectable, 1 billion doses. I hope most of this would move this year. As Mia said, we need it now. We need these shots in the arm. But let's remember that we need more doses. In other words, production needs to go up. It has to be more diversified. And we need these vials to turn into shots in the arm, meaning the whole logistics, delivery, last mile vaccinations has to be funded. We are what we ask for is 35 billion in grants, 15 billion in concessional finance. We are confident that concessional finance is secured. The question is where we are with the 35 billion. Since we made this announcement of our plan, there has been movement. We assess that about 1/3 of the 35 billion is now secured from public, but also from private sources. So a good start. I want to praise those that have stepped forward, but we have a way to go. And a solvable problem at a not trivial, but very manageable price. We ought to muster the will to solve it. I very much hope that the G20 will march in that direction of bringing the resources and bring it up front, bring it now, so we can help the world to get out of this tragic pandemic faster, and we can do what is morally right, but also what is in our own self-interest. And one interesting fact, we have been looking at data on public opinion in advanced economies. People in advanced economies that are now benefiting themselves from vaccinations, they recognize the threat of mutation and they recognize the importance of vaccinating the rest of the world. So somewhere around 70% of citizens of rich countries are in favor of their governments paying for the vaccination of the rest of the world. When we have that kind of public support, when we talk about a solvable problem, it is so very important that we move fast, and we will continue to be that voice of reason. And hopefully we would see more progress. We would see the gap filled.
Minister Randriamandrato, you're going to have the last say here, the thorn among the roses. Your thoughts on what you'd like to see from the international community, and also just quickly your assessment of what transpired at the G7 meeting.
Well, the world is living a unique, context. We are still a global village. And what we are facing right now with the COVID-19 is telling us how the world is now mutating to a more and more, global community at the global level. So what we have discussed today show how much it is important to continue hammering what is important. And what is important is solidarity. Mm-hmm. Facing climate change is not only about money. It's not only about concessional loan. Mm-hmm. It's not only about the IMF responsibility. It's a collective and public awareness vis-a-vis the future of our planet. We're not going to return to 100 years ago. We are now facing the new realities, and therefore we have to adapt our policies to that new reality. And above all, we have to make sure that new generation also adapt their state of mind to that new reality. Unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, technology is sometimes pushing us to think differently, but we shall continue to make sure that le bon sens, as we say in French, the bon sens, the good sense, govern the world, rather than the interest of capitalism or the logic of economic productivity and so on. So let me just express our appreciation and thank the IMF for what we have achieved so far as Madagascar is concerned. Let me just stress that Madagascar is not an indebted country. We have a less debt burden. So I do understand the reality at some countries like in Barbados and island in the Caribbean, but Madagascar is a different reality as regard to debt burden. And I shall thank the IMF for continuing helping us improving our macroeconomic situation. Thank you once again.
A sobering conversation has been. Richard Randriamandrato, Finance Minister and Economy Minister of Madagascar, Mia Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados, Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the IMF. We thank you so much for your insights today. And my thanks as well to you for joining us online. And if you're part of the academic portion of the conference, that will continue after the break. That's at 10 past 10. And with that, I'm Haslinda. Amin. Thank you. Have a great day ahead.